Have you ever had the feeling that something or someone was watching you even when you were alone? That uneasy sensation crawling up your spine, making you glance over your shoulder even though you know you're supposed to be safe. I used to think those feelings were just tricks of the mind, until I experienced the terrifying truth for myself in Blackwood House. It all started innocently enough. I had been searching for a quiet place to write, away from the chaos of daily life. That's when I found the listing for a small, secluded house for rent, Blackwood House. The ad said it was an old country home on the edge of a forest, perfect for those who needed peace and solitude. The pictures showed a quaint, charming place with whitewashed walls and ivy creeping up the sides. But there was something about it, a shadow in the corner of one of the photos, or the slightly tilted window frames, that made me feel a bit uneasy. Still, the price was unbeatable, and I convinced myself it was exactly what I needed to focus on my writing. I arrived at Blackwood House on a gloomy Friday afternoon. The sky was a dull grey, and the wind howled through the trees, making the place feel more isolated than I had anticipated. As I stood in front of the house, my suitcase in hand, I felt a cold shiver crawl over me. The house seemed to loom over me, despite its modest size. It was as if it was waiting for me, silently watching. But I shook it off, blaming my nerves and exhaustion from the drive. The inside of the house was just as the pictures had shown, rustic, with creaky wooden floors and vintage furniture. It smelled faintly of dust and something else I couldn't quite place, like wet earth. I explored the small rooms, trying to get a sense of the place. The kitchen was cozy, the living room had an old fireplace, and the bedroom upstairs was simple, with a large window overlooking the forest. There was a strange stillness in the air, though, as if the house was holding its breath. That first night I heard it, a soft creaking, like footsteps moving slowly across the floorboards downstairs. My heart raced as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was the old house settling, or maybe the wind playing tricks. But deep down I knew better. The sound was too deliberate. It wasn't random, it was moving, slowly, purposefully. I got out of bed, my hands trembling as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. The house was completely dark, and the only sound was the low moan of the wind outside. I strained to listen, but the footsteps had stopped. The floor creaked beneath me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I forced myself to go downstairs, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But when I reached the living room, there was no one there. Nothing was out of place. I laughed nervously at my own paranoia and went back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was in the house with me. The next day, I tried to ignore what had happened. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But as the day wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger. I kept hearing faint whispers, like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. But the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch further than they should have, like they were reaching for me. By the third night, the footsteps had become louder, more distinct. They would start slowly, pacing the downstairs hallway before moving up the stairs. Each step creaked ominously, closer and closer to my bedroom door. I was paralyzed with fear, lying in bed with the blankets pulled up to my chin, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear me. And then it stopped, right outside my door. For what felt like an eternity, I waited, my breath caught in my throat, afraid that if I moved, whatever was out there would know I was awake. The door handle rattled slightly, and I nearly screamed. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. No footsteps, no rattling, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I was a mess, exhausted, anxious, and terrified of what would happen next. I called the landlord to ask if there had been any history with the house, hoping for some logical explanation. He was vague, brushing off my concerns. But before he hung up, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You're not the first person to ask about strange noises in that house," he said, his voice low. "But no one ever stays long enough to find out what's causing them." That was all I needed to hear. I decided to leave the house that day. Whatever was in Blackwood House, I didn't want to face it. As I packed my things, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were faster, more frantic, like something didn't want me to leave. I threw my suitcase into the car and slammed the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As I sped down the long dirt road leading away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in the upstairs window, where my bedroom had been, was a figure. It was just a shadow, barely visible against the pale glass, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. waiting, as if it knew I would be back. I never returned to Blackwood House, but even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear those footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and always coming closer. The house still stands at the edge of the forest, waiting for its next guest. But take my advice. If you ever hear about a little place called Blackwood House, stay far away. Whatever haunts that place is still there, waiting for someone like you to walk through its doors. Because once you do, you might never leave.